Welcome to another episode of Diabetes Care on Air, a different way to bring the research in diabetes care to life. Today, we are featuring the content of the May 2023 issue. My name is Dr. Alice Cheng from the University of Toronto.
And I'm Mike Rickles from the University of Pennsylvania, and we are your co-hosts for this podcast. As per usual, Alice and I are going to interview authors of a couple of the feature articles selected by the editors of Diabetes Care, followed by our rapid exchange segment where we give quick highlights from other articles we thought were of particular interest.
So, Mike, what did you think of the cover art for the May 2023 issue?
Just incredible imagery, Alice. The piece, Sugar Moon, to me represents the moonshot we are all engaged in, adding one piece of evidence to the next, to one day end the problem of diabetes for our patients.
That's pretty deep, Mike. I'm quite impressed. In fact, I was fortunate to get a chance to speak with the artist, Mr. Rohan Arora from Delhi, India, to discuss his inspiration behind the piece and a whole lot more. So it'll be interesting to hear from Mr. Arora as to what his inspiration was and whether it was any way similar to the way you interpret it, Mike. But I think it's a great way to sort of showcase how art can be interpreted by different people.
Looking forward to hearing it.
The May 2023 issue of Diabetes Care features cover art entitled Sugar Moon, created by Mr. Rohan Arora, a designer, a researcher, a certified diabetes educator, and so much more, from Delhi, India. Thank you so much for joining me today, Rohan, and agreeing to be part of this podcast.
Hey everyone, thanks Alice for inviting me, and thanks especially to Diabetes Care for featuring my artwork in May 2023 issue. And really glad to be here and to be speaking with you.
It's great. Thank you so much, Rohan. So first of all, congratulations. Congratulations on having your art featured, which is wonderful. And you're going to have lots of people being able to see your art and enjoy it. But before we discuss the specific piece of work that you did, can you share with us your story as to how art and diabetes intersect for you?
So I have been living with diabetes since the last 15 years, and professionally I have worked as a graphic designer for many years. And I find that art allows me to reflect and express my diabetes experience really well. And also storytelling through art can provide the perspective, so that has allowed me to make that intersection between diabetes and art, and really put in my all the words into my art and my experiences.
That's wonderful. So it's been a way for you to process your diabetes. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but also a way for you to share your experience with other people, which is wonderful. And thank you for that. As I was reading about you, I also learned about the Blue Circle Diabetes Foundation, for which you play a very major role. So can you please tell us a bit more about the Blue Circle Diabetes Foundation?
Sure. Blue Circle Diabetes Foundation is an NGO based out of India, and they are also a support group for people living with all types of diabetes. And they try and educate and empower people living with diabetes and provide them with a safe space to engage in dialogues. So I have been working with this organization since the last 4 years, and I have conducted multiple awareness sessions in schools, old age home, corporates, etc. Through this, I have experienced how community can, by sharing their lived experience, right, how we can help each other and really motivate each other to fight diabetes together.
So if someone wanted to become involved in Blue Circle Diabetes Foundation, maybe you can first clarify with us, you said this is international, so how would one find Blue Circle Diabetes Foundation? How would one potentially get involved? Are there other countries and all of that sort of information?
You can find us on Facebook, and we have around 80,000 members on Facebook. You can search for Blue Circle Diabetes on all different social media as well. And we have different campaigns running on Instagram, Facebook, through our website as well, bluecircle.foundation. You can find us on all the social media. You can go in and type for Blue Circle Diabetes Foundation. And we have an app as well, both on Android and iOS as well, with the name of Blue Circle Diabetes Foundation. There you will find a lot of videos, educational stuff, and you can interact with patients from across the world. We have patients from Africa, India, USA as well.
Wonderful. So a broad diabetes community, which is great. So now let's get to your featured piece on the cover art. It's titled Sugar Moon. So what does it mean to you, and what was the inspiration behind it?
So in this artwork, moon is depicted as a big ball of sugar. And this artwork highlights a mother's empathy and how with love and joy in small things, we can overcome all the odds. And here a kid living with type 1 complains to his mother that why does he have to prick multiple times a day? And the mother creates a narrative where she asks her young son to believe the moon to be made up of sugar, and one day he'll reach it by building a ladder of used glucometer strips. So this is a way of storytelling, and it uplifts the son's mood and brings a smile to his face. And this inspiration came from interacting with many mothers on our helplines. We run a helpline called Buddy Project, where we receive calls from all over India, and mostly mothers complain of how children tend not to listen sometimes, and how they can make the children test their sugars or eat something. And through this, we were just trying to create a narrative on how do mothers actually persuade children to follow some things in the context of diabetes.
And there are many stories that often involve the moon, isn't it? So that's a beautiful story, and thank you very much for sharing that. And finally, what advice would you give to someone who's listening right now, who's thinking about submitting their art to be considered for a cover of Diabetes Care? What would you say to them?
First of all, like, many thanks to Diabetes Care for giving this opportunity to everyone to get their art published on the cover. And my suggestion would be true to your feelings and show empathy, and good art will get created, right? And do not procrastinate. So if you have an idea, you can just create it and just send it across. And it need not be that you need to have it refined to a particular point. You can just create it and improve upon it later.
Great advice. Thank you. Thank you so much, Rohan, for sharing your time and talent with us. And for anyone listening who has original art that they wish to submit, please email the ADA at productionmanager@diabetes.org or visit the Diabetes Care website for more information. Thank you so much, Rohan.
Thanks, Dr. Alice.
In the May 2023 issue of Diabetes Care is a feature article entitled Abatacept for Delay of Type 1 Diabetes Progression in Stage 1 Relatives at Risk, a randomized, double-masked controlled trial. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to discuss this important study and its findings with lead author, Dr. William Russell. Dr. Russell is the Cornelius Vanderbilt Professor of Pediatrics and Director of the Division of Endocrinology and Diabetes in Pediatrics at Vanderbilt University. Welcome, Bill, and thank you for joining us.
Mike, it's a real pleasure today to review what we found in this study. We certainly learned a lot, and we have even more and hopefully better questions as we move forward.
Bill, congratulations to you and the Type 1 Diabetes TrialNet Study Group on this feature article. Your study investigated whether treatment of individuals with stage 1 type 1 diabetes with monthly infusions of Abatacept for a year could delay the development of abnormal glucose tolerance or stage 2 type 1 diabetes, as well as delay development of overt diabetes, now referred to as stage 3 type 1 diabetes. Could you begin by telling us how Abatacept works and why this intervention was selected as an approach to prevention?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So Abatacept, whose biochemical name is CTLA4-IG, is a soluble protein. It's a drug that prevents co-stimulatory signals from antigen-presenting cells to activate T cells through the CD86 axis. It isn't the only pathway that's used for co-stimulation of T cells, so that's an important point because there are other avenues to activate T cells, but it seems to be a major pathway. It doesn't deplete the body of T cells. In other words, you don't lose T cells. They marginalize and return, so it's short-lived. But our understanding is that it prevents generation of autoreactive T cells early in the process. Abatacept also blocks activation of some potentially beneficial components of the immune system, such as regulatory C cells. That's also an effect that we observed, and it's an important one to keep in mind as we move forward. So Abatacept, under the commercial name Orencia, has been on the market since approved by the FDA in 2005 for the treatment of other autoimmune conditions such as juvenile idiopathic arthritis, JRA, it used to be called, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis. And there are some other autoimmune conditions in which it is not effective, but there's a lot known about its actions, some mechanistic insights, and also about its side effects. So we in TrialNet first reported in 2011 and then subsequently in 2014 that a 2-year course of Abatacept, that is 2 years of monthly infusions of the drug, delayed the decline of C-peptide in individuals who were treated shortly after the diagnosis of diabetes. So that would be stage 3. Even a year after the treatment ended. So they had 2 years of treatment, but even in the 3rd year, there was a significant difference in C-peptide release in response to a mixed meal tolerance test compared to controls. And also the safety profile was encouraging.
Thank you, Bill. And so in the present study, you also demonstrated an effect on preserving endogenous insulin secretion, at least over the 12 months of active intervention. But in this prevention study, Abatacept did not significantly delay progression to glucose intolerance. Last year, tocilizumab, which inhibits T cells through a different mechanism than Abatacept, received FDA approval as a treatment for individuals with stage 2 type 1 diabetes based on demonstrated efficacy to delay the development of stage 3 disease. Do you think the outcomes with Abatacept on disease progression in terms of glucose intolerance may have been different if tested in stage 2 type 1 diabetes as opposed to stage 1? And what was the rationale for going all the way to stage 1 for this prevention study?
Yeah, that's a very good question, very, very important. After our initial success in maintaining beta cell function in stage 3 individuals, we were enthusiastic to look at it as a prevention study. That original one was an intervention, but that was only after the disease had progressed to stage 3. So it brings up the important question of like the creation, the definition of 3 stages of progression of type 1 diabetes. It's been really helpful, but there are a lot of things we really don't know about the different stages, especially with regard to immune dysfunction. So basically, to an individual who is not at risk to develop diabetes, when they enter stage 1, if they develop autoimmunity, and that's defined in the definitions by the presence of 2 or more different beta cell antibodies. And we know in long-term follow-up studies that puts people at virtually 100% risk of progressing to stage 3 or treatable diabetes over at least a roughly 20-year span. So the presence of antibodies, of autoantibodies, is a component in each of the 3 stages. But then what distinguishes stage 1 from stage 2 and from stage 2 to stage 3, those progressions, is a metabolic readout. The glucose C-peptide response to an oral glucose challenge, normal glucose tolerance in stage 1, abnormal glucose tolerance, but not yet diabetes in stage 2, and then overt by FDA classification, diabetic glucose response in stage 3. But we really don't have a detailed understanding of the subtleties of the immunologic changes that characterize stage 1, 2, and 3, that how they differ, and exactly what would be the most likely target when you're trying to develop a way to prevent progression. In fact, one thing that's often helpful was we looked at the results of NOD mice, the spontaneously diabetic mice who were treated with Abatacept before we started the study, and the effects there seemed to be greatest early in the progression of diabetes. In other words, if you treated the animals at stage 1, if there's not really a mouse stage 1, but the equivalent of stage 1 when they have autoimmunity expressed but normal glucose levels, Abatacept was very effective in preventing the progression to diabetes, but it was much less effective when it was given after diabetes was established. So recall our original data in the original TrialNet study was in stage 3, and we saw an effect that persisted at least a year after the drug was stopped. So it was natural to consider that we might have a greater effect if we treated earlier at stage 1 or stage 2. And I can tell you one thing that influenced our settling on stage 1 is that in the tocilizumab study, which was also done in TrialNet, stage 2 is a rather fickle, kind of metastable state. You have people who have abnormal glucose tolerance, and to be officially designated in stage 2 in a research study, you have to have confirmed glucose tolerance tests that tell you the same thing. And it was very difficult sometimes to confirm stage 2 biochemically, in other words, with glucose tolerance. Sometimes people would have impaired glucose tolerance, and that the next time you went to confirm it, they were normal, or they had progressed to diabetes. We considered stage 1 a somewhat more stable state, and that's another reason we started at stage 1.
That's really interesting, Bill, and makes terrific sense. Now, in your current study, rates of progression to glucose intolerance turned out to be lower than anticipated. And that may have led to the trial being underpowered to detect a statistically significant difference in this primary outcome of glucose intolerance progression. You discuss in the paper how insulin autoantibody positive individuals were excluded from the present study to avoid competition with enrollment of a prevention trial with oral insulin that was also enrolling at the time, but for our listeners turned out to be a negative study. How much of an impact could limiting enrollment to only insulin autoantibody negative individuals have had on your current study's findings?
You describe a problem in the study design that we didn't anticipate. I mean, traditionally in TrialNet, at least in the early stages of the concept of stages and defining autoimmunity, each of the antibodies that we tested, there are 4 different biochemical antibodies and the cytohistochemical islet ICA assay that are used in TrialNet. But it was, if you had 2 positive assays, it seemed not to matter which 2 they were, that they were equivalent in their contribution to the pathophysiology. So it didn't really matter which antibodies were at play as long as there were multiple different epitopes targeted. So we know now better that there probably is, especially from the TEDdy study and others, that there are probably is a difference in the diabetes endotype that results from different antibody combinations. As our study began to recruit participants, TrialNet was concluding the oral insulin trial, as you mentioned, TN07, which required 2 positive antibodies, but one of them had to be against insulin. So those people all had to have positive insulin autoantibodies and 1 additional one. And it was a longstanding practice in TrialNet, and I think in clinical trials in general, to avoid having 2 different studies competing for the same subject. So it was decided, not on any scientific insight, that our study would limit people who had insulin autoantibody, exclude them, so that the other study, TN07, could wrap up. So a retrospective review of old TrialNet data, so the data that led to the prediction of if we started in stage 1, what's the rate at which people would convert to stage 2 if they had 2 or more positive antibodies. We looked at the data and saw that if we excluded insulin positivity as one of the positive antibodies, the rate of progression from stage 1 to stage 2 was significantly slower in that same population than the group that allowed insulin antibody positivity. As a matter of fact, the analysis, when we separated the data from this previous study there was no treatment involved, pretty much recapitulated our findings in this study, that if insulin positive individuals are excluded, the rate of progression is slower. So I think it's a fascinating question, and one that we're asking, whether the immunobiology changes because specifically insulin autoantibodies are absent, or merely revolves around the fact that insulin is very common, and especially in younger kids, as the presenting, like the first antibody. And what we noted in a retrospective analysis of the natural history study data is that when you had 2 or more antibodies, one of which was insulin, 71% of those people had 3 or more antibodies. So they had even wider range of epitope kind of positivity. Whereas in a group that was restricted to insulin negative subjects, it was only about a quarter of them, about 27% had 3 or more antibodies. So it's possible that it had to do more with just the number of positive antibodies. But the more interesting to me, physiologic question is there something unique about insulin that contributes to the rate of progression, insulin autoantibodies? So of note, in the current study, there were 6 participants who had a screening visit, in which time they were insulin autoantibody negative. That was, looking at their eligibility to be in the trials. But between the screening visit, which qualified them to be in the trials, and the randomization stage, which was the day they got their first infusion, they had developed insulin autoantibodies. And then others who were in the study who were insulin autoantibody at randomization acquired them through the course of the trial. So we looked, and as best we could see from the data, Abatacept didn't seem to inhibit the acquisition of insulin autoantibodies, but the study wasn't really designed to do that in a very statistically sound way. So interesting questions there.
Really interesting, Bill, and fascinating to see a lack of effect on acquisition of new autoantibodies, presumably involving B lymphocyte populations and development of new plasma cell populations, but while targeting the T cell activation that we know is important for ultimately killing and destroying insulin-producing beta cells. So both in the previous study of Abatacept in stage 3 type 1 diabetes and this present study in stage 1 type 1 diabetes, there's treatment preservation of endogenous insulin secretion that's been demonstrated. And so that implies some period of protection of beta cells from autoimmune destruction with treatment with Abatacept. So what are the next steps in the further evaluation of a possible role for Abatacept as a disease-modifying therapy in type 1 diabetes?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, and we're very encouraged. We take our data to indicate that Abatacept really does have a place as a disease-modifying agent in the progression of type 1 diabetes. We didn't meet the expectations of a 46% reduction in the rate of conversion to abnormal glucose tolerance after 81 events, but we did show a 30% reduction overall in the study. And then furthermore, again, this was not designed for statistical significance, but as we analyzed the interim risk, it basically showed that by 12 months, by the end of the treatment period, there was a 53% reduction in conversion from stage 1 to stage 2. This was associated with an improved C-peptide secretion, as you mentioned, and also by the expected reduction in T follicular helper cells, which had been noted in our previous study in stage 3. They are a pretty sound immunologic marker of Abatacept action. So basically, a year after treatment ceased, these measures were not different from placebo controls. So this seems to validate one thing that our rheumatology colleagues know very well. Abatacept is useful in interrupting immune cell activation and in managing diseases like rheumatoid arthritis only while it's being given. Treatment is rarely interrupted. So there's a lot of enthusiasm now for an upcoming trial, TN25, that is going to combine 2 years of Abatacept therapy, so not one, in stage 3 participants after a pretreatment with rituximab, which depletes B cells. So it kind of addresses the point you brought up earlier about antibody participation in the process. So that study is about to begin enrolling. And then also, our study also found that Abatacept resulted in a decrease in regulatory T cells over the period of treatment. That's been shown before, but that's not exactly an effect you want to have when you're trying to restore immune tolerance and prevent or delay progression to aggressive autoimmune attack on the beta cells. So we've begun to think about, there's not a trial yet in preparation, but the use of Abatacept with other T regulatory preserving therapies, perhaps interleukin-2, and we're still kind of toying with the idea of that, but there are new questions to answer.
Well, and it's terrific to hear about those new studies happening now and in development, and certainly look forward to seeing what comes on the horizon. So lastly, Bill, what final takeaway messages do you have for our listeners?
Well, we didn't meet our predicted study endpoint, but all the data we have show that while concurrent with Abatacept therapy, all of the immune and metabolic markers indicated a beneficial effect on the immunopathology as we understand it, and also on the reduction of progression to stage 2. So, and all of this with tolerable risk to patients. That's another really important point. So my takeaway is that Abatacept is going to have a place in disease modifying of the progression of type 1 diabetes through its stages. And as we conclude this study, we really have better questions to ask, and we're revising our strategy. So I would say, stay tuned. You haven't heard the end of this drug.
Dr. William Russell, thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today. I really appreciate all I've learned from our discussion and your TrialNet study that moves us one step closer to solving the problem of autoimmunity and disease progression in type 1 diabetes. I encourage the listeners to access the full article in the May issue of Diabetes Care.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's been a pleasure to join you.
One of the feature articles from the May 2023 issue of Diabetes Care is titled Metformin and Cancer, Solutions to a Real-World Evidence Failure. I'm joined by the senior author, Professor Sammy Suissa, a distinguished James McGill professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics, as well as the Department of Medicine at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. Welcome and thank you for being part of this podcast.
Oh, thank you, Alice. This is my pleasure.
So, to begin, I want to first of all congratulate you as well as Dr. Oriana Yu for this feature article. I have to say that as I read it, it struck me as a cautionary tale of the potential pitfalls of observational study design and the steps we can take to right the wrongs of the past. Maybe that's being a bit dramatic, but that was certainly how it felt as I was reading it. So let's start at the beginning. Please tell us the metformin and cancer story.
It is, in fact, a cautionary tale. I agree with you. I call it the metformin saga, with a paper published in the BMJ reporting on a cohort of patients with type 2 diabetes from Scotland. And in that cohort study, they identified the patients who developed cancer and found that the ones who were using metformin had a lower incidence of any cancer. And that study itself was called a research pointer study, and it generated several subsequent studies using claims databases used to investigate this specific question of the relationship between metformin and cancer incidence and metformin and cancer mortality. And simply 6 years later, already 24 observational studies were published and reported spectacular reductions in cancer incidence and mortality with metformin. For example, 50% reductions in lung cancer in patients using metformin, 75% reductions in the incidence of liver cancer. These are quite spectacular. Breast cancer was of specific interest as well. In a paper that we published in 2012 in Diabetes Care itself, it was a review paper, we showed that these 24 studies that had been published to date, all observational studies, they all had time-related biases, in particular immortal time bias, and these biases tend to exaggerate the benefit of a drug. From this point on, these observational studies were very important in looking at the potential of metformin as a treatment for cancer, and several randomized control trials were then conducted. This is basically a bit of the story. Now, the very first randomized trial looked at metformin as an adjuvant treatment for advanced pancreatic cancer. It was published in 2015, and it showed that, in fact, there was absolutely no effect on recurrence or mortality with metformin in that randomized trial of patients with advanced pancreatic cancer. In 2020, there had already been 9 randomized trials that had been published, and a meta-analysis of these trials again confirmed that there was absolutely no benefit with metformin on a variety of different cancers. But really, the largest randomized control trial was just published a year ago. It was launched in 2010, and it involved over 3,500 women who were followed for 5 years. They all had early breast cancer, and metformin was given as an additional treatment to usual treatment for these women who came from 4 countries, Canada, Switzerland, the US, and the UK. And it was only published last year in 2022. And this study found, in fact, that the addition of metformin to standard breast cancer treatment did not improve invasive disease-free survival. So again, a negative study of metformin, the largest one that all were expecting and waiting for. So at this time, we have extensive evidence from randomized control trials of no effect of metformin as a treatment for cancer. And our upcoming paper reviews this metformin cancer saga, and it discusses the wide discrepancy in findings between observational and randomized studies.
Wow, it's definitely is a saga as you described it, and I mean, frankly, somewhat disappointing, right? That the randomized control trials did not actually show what the observational studies suggested. But you mentioned that immortal time bias and other time-related biases may explain this discrepancy. So, can you explain for us then what exactly is immortal time bias?
Yes, so immortal time bias applies, it arises mainly in cohort studies. So there are observational studies where the definition of exposure to a treatment, so to metformin, uses observations in the future to classify exposure. So, for example, I think the best way is to give an example. So, if I have a cohort of patients who are all diagnosed with type 2 diabetes at some point in time, and they're followed over 10 years, and we want to know whether metformin reduces mortality due to cancer in that cohort, some patients will start metformin not on the day of diagnosis, but maybe a year later, maybe 2 years later, maybe 4 years later. Now, if we compare the ones who use metformin in that 10-year period with the ones who do not, then what we have done here is introduce an immortal time period, because the patients who receive metformin, who initiate metformin treatment 4 years after the diagnosis, have to be alive on that day 4 years later to receive the metformin. And that period is called a period of immortality. And by including this period in the analysis, you obviously, the patients will be using metformin will necessarily have a longer survival than the patients who do not use metformin, specifically because they have this guaranteed survival period, immortal period before being initiated on metformin. So that is the bias that has plagued these studies, basically looking into the future to define metformin and imposing this immortal period and making metformin look much more effective. I can give you other examples. There is an example of a study just published last year in 2022, 10 years after we published our paper in Diabetes Care that warned about and explained the immortal time bias in these studies. Just a year ago, a study was done in patients who had undergone surgery for colorectal cancer. And the study followed the patients for 2 years, and in there, compare the patients who were being given metformin during that period to the patients who did not receive metformin. And clearly, if you are going to receive metformin during that period, to receive metformin for an extended period of time, let's say 90 days, as they did in that study, clearly these patients have to be alive to receive metformin, and they have to be alive for 90 days subsequently. So that immortal time period will give a guaranteed advantage to the metformin group. And of course, as a result, the study reported a relative risk of 0.45, so almost more than a 50% reduction in mortality, all-cause mortality in the patients who receive metformin. But again, this is a flawed number because they were given this guaranteed advantage by the definition of the study. So immortal time bias is very important, especially that it always exaggerates the benefit of a drug, which is given in the examples that I gave you.
Thank you for that. So, as you mentioned, though, the concept of repurposing old drugs is one that we should pursue. So let's talk about solutions. So in your paper, you talk about the new user cohort design, as well as the prevalent new user design. So maybe let's begin with the new user cohort design. What is it, and when would one use it?
So as its name describes it well, this is a design that looks at the new users of a study group. The new user design that I mentioned first is a design that emulates a randomized controlled trial. And to do that, it identifies patients who, for example, initiate metformin at some point in time, and that becomes the day zero when they start to be followed up. And in that new user design, they are compared to patients who initiate another treatment. So, for example, we would say sulfonylurea as that first treatment. And the two groups are then followed up from that point onwards for the incidence of cancer or other outcomes or mortality or so. So here, what you notice is that this design here does not involve any time before they started to use metformin. So that immortal time disappears. It's taken away by the new design. Same thing with the sulfonylurea group. It also taken away. So you have eliminated immortal time bias by using this design, and you've emulated a randomized controlled trial. Now, of course, the two groups are not going to be the same. This is not a randomized trial. So there are some sophisticated statistical tools that are used to make the two groups comparable. So, for example, propensity scores are a technique that is used. And if the databases, the electronic health records on which these studies are done, contain sufficient information to make the two groups comparable, basically that we compare like with like, the study will emulate very, very accurately, very closely a randomized controlled trial while avoiding all of this immortal time bias and other time-related biases that we discuss in the paper. So basically, the concept is simple. How can you emulate a randomized controlled trial? Now, of course, when you're interested in metformin, the comparator that you're using cannot be associated with cancer. So, for example, some studies have associated pioglitazone with some cancers, and also insulin analogs have been associated with breast cancer. So we have to be careful that the choice of the comparator not be associated with the outcome of interest. But in essence, we are emulating a randomized controlled trial and avoiding all of these vexing time-related biases.
So that's the new user cohort design. Now, what about the prevalent new user design that you also mentioned in the paper? What is that, and when would one use that?
Yes, so this is in fact the design that is most appropriate to all of the dozens of studies that we have seen in this field that all have the bias. Why is it appropriate? Because all of these designs were comparing metformin use versus non-use, not versus another drug or another treatment for type 2 diabetes, but basically versus non-use. So at this point, this design also identifies the new users of metformin at the time that they initiate the treatment. And again, it emulates a randomized control trial by finding a patient, matched patient in the electronic health record that visited a physician for the same diagnosis. They visited a physician, but did not receive metformin on that day. They could have received another treatment, or they could have received no treatment, or perhaps only recommendations regarding diet or so, but they visited a physician, so they had an opportunity to receive metformin. So it's like the other new user design, except that here we don't have a comparator drug. All we have is that the patient did not receive metformin on that day, but visited a physician, so they had the opportunity to receive metformin. And similarly, we use propensity scores or other statistical tools to make the two groups equivalent. And this way, we are able to answer the question of whether metformin compared to no metformin, which is what all of these studies have done, is associated with a lower incidence of cancer or other outcomes as well. And here again, you completely avoid all time-related biases, especially immortal time bias.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. As a simple clinician who knows little to nothing about epidemiology and biostatistics, what is the simple checklist, if even one exists? What is the simple checklist that I should look for when I'm reading an observational study? Because, I mean, as you know, there are many, and I'm now weary of drawing conclusions. So, what should I be looking out for when I'm reading an observational study to know that the design is, in fact, free of these time related biases that you've discussed?
So as I said before, these, especially immortal time bias and the other time-related biases, tend to exaggerate the benefit of a drug. So my first suggestion, and that should be the very first one for everyone, is use your common sense. Use your smell test. If it's too good to be true, then it's not true. You know that it is not true. So for example, a first-line treatment for type 2 diabetes that reduces the incidence of liver cancer by 95%. In fact, one of the studies actually showed that. So basically, you are eliminating entirely liver cancer from a population just by giving them a pill. Does it make sense? No, it does not. So I think using common sense is probably the first point in your checklist. That should be the very first one. If it doesn't make sense, then I would be very careful about the design of the study. And then when you start investigating the design of the study, you want to know that the follow-up for all of the patients, if you're studying metformin and cancer, started at the time of the first metformin prescription, and that the comparator group started also at a comparable time point and not at some other time point as well. So time is important. Is anyone looking into the future to identify people who are using metformin. As soon as you're looking into the future, these people have survived. And because they have survived, it will introduce bias. So I think that probably is the second and important point is exposure defined by looking into the future in these database studies. And that mistake is very easy to do, very tempting, but unfortunately, it leads to incorrect results.
So wonderful advice, simple checklist, but I got to say the common sense one, although it makes sense. I mean, I want to believe in fairy tales, right? So when you read a paper that sort of gives you a result that you wish is true, you're right. We got to take a step back and maybe ask ourselves, is this actually possible? But thank you very much, Professor Sammy Suissa, for sharing your expertise with us today and helping me, a simple clinician, better understand the pitfalls, but also solutions to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past and sharing with us the cautionary tale of metformin and cancer. And I encourage the listeners to read the full article in the May issue of Diabetes Care, to also check out the helpful visuals included in the article to help it come to life. So thank you again, Professor Sammy Suissa. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Alice. And I'm looking forward to the next 10 years with no such flaws in all observational studies published in Diabetes Care and other journals as well.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Let's move on now to our Diabetes Care Rapid Exchange, where Alice and I chat about some articles we found particularly interesting this month.
I suspect we picked quite different articles this time, Mike. That goes to show the breadth of topics that are published in Diabetes Care.
That's quite true, Alice. So why don't I get started? SGLT2 inhibitors are known to increase endogenous glucose production, which seems to attenuate the reduction in blood glucose that would otherwise be anticipated from glucosuria induced by these agents. And SGLT2 inhibitors also increase ketone production, but the exact mechanisms for how these effects occur is unclear. Dr. Siham Abdelghani and Ahmad Khattab and colleagues from the University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio investigated the mechanisms of SGLT2 inhibitor-induced endogenous glucose and ketone production. They studied 12 individuals with type 2 diabetes who were randomized 2-to-1 to receive 25 milligrams of the SGLT2 inhibitor empagliflozin or placebo, once under fasting and another time under pancreatic clamp conditions. During fasting, empagliflozin led to an increase in endogenous glucose production, free fatty acids, and ketones associated with decreased insulin and increased glucagon concentrations. The pancreatic clamp condition blocked changes in insulin or glucagon, with empagliflozin still increasing endogenous glucose production, but not free fatty acids or ketones. Norepinephrine turnover increased with empagliflozin under both conditions. Thus, these results suggest the increase in endogenous glucose production observed with SGLT2 inhibitors is occurring independently of changes in insulin or glucagon and may be explained by increased norepinephrine turnover.
It's very interesting, Mike. I mean, we've been using SGLT2 inhibitors for quite some time now, and we continue to try to understand exactly how they do what they do. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. I'm actually going to cheat a little bit now and talk about two articles in one segment, as they both try to address the question of whether COVID-19 infection increases the risk of incident type 1 diabetes in one article and any diabetes in the other article. So let's start with the cohort analysis from Scotland by Dr. Paul McKeague and colleagues. They looked at a cohort of over 1.8 million people under the age of 35 without diabetes, followed from March 2020 to November 2021. During that time, over 365,000 people had at least one COVID-19 infection, and 1,074 people developed type 1 diabetes. The rate ratio for incident type 1 diabetes associated with first positive COVID-19 test was a non-significant 0.86 when the infection was more than 30 days prior to the diagnosis of type 1 diabetes. Now, it's worth noting that previous studies from claims databases suggested that there was a relationship. But when they looked at infection less than 30 days, prior to the type 1 diabetes diagnosis, the rate ratio was a significant 2.62. However, before we jump to the conclusion that there's a causal relationship, it turns out that both negative and positive tests were more frequent in the days surrounding diabetes presentation, which makes sense as people were probably not feeling well and therefore doing more tests. Now, the authors also noted that the incidence of type 1 diabetes during 2020 to 2021 was 20% higher than the 7-year average among those aged 0 to 14 years. So they concluded that although there was an increase in type 1 diabetes incidence among children during the pandemic, COVID-19 infection itself was not the cause. And along the same lines, Dr. Naomi Holman and colleagues from the UK performed cohort study of people admitted to hospital for COVID-19 and or pneumonia between April and August 2020 in England and identified incident diabetes post-discharge up to the end of March 2021. Now, the comparative cohorts were people admitted with pneumonia prior to the pandemic. Bottom line was that the incidence rates of diabetes were not significantly different among those hospitalized for COVID-19 with or without pneumonia, or those hospitalized with pneumonia before the pandemic. So taken together, these studies do not support a clear impact of COVID-19 infection on the incidence of type 1 or type 2 diabetes.
And so the pendulum on the topic of COVID-19 and incident diabetes takes a swing now towards the null. I have a feeling this will not be the last time we hear about this topic. Okay, Alice, I'm going to follow your lead and also bring up 2 articles in one segment. Both assess a novel once-weekly basal insulin engineered by combining a single-chain insulin variant with a human IgG-Fc domain. Dr. Christophe Kazda from Lilly, France, and Ms. Juliana Buvaleski from Eli Lilly and Company and colleagues report on 2 randomized clinical trials of basal insulin Fc, or BIF for short, compared to basal insulin degludec over 26 weeks. One trial conducted in type 1 diabetes and the other conducted in insulin-naive type 2 diabetes. In both studies, BIF was non-inferior to degludec for glycemic control measured by hemoglobin A1C, with no difference seen for continuous glucose monitoring defined serious hypoglycemia events. Fasting glucose as measured by continuous glucose monitoring was higher with BIF than degludec in the type 1 diabetes study, but not in the type 2 diabetes study, where similar reductions in fasting glucose as well as hemoglobin A1C were observed. These findings are encouraging for insulin injection users, regardless of diabetes type, who may be seeking a lower injection burden or are struggling to comply with daily long-acting insulin administration.
I think it's always great, right, to have options to offer people, and the once weekly idea and reducing the burden of diabetes is always so important. But I got to say, every time I hear the word BIF, I mean, my mind goes to the movie Back to the Future. So we'll see if I'm able to not giggle every time I say the word BIF in the future. Let's switch gears and talk about the effect of ethnicity on the development of referable sight-threatening diabetic retinopathy in type 1 diabetes. Now, this is a topic that has not previously been looked at in great detail, so I found it quite interesting. Dr. Janica Karolidi and colleagues from King's College London in the UK described the risk factors for development of sight-threatening diabetic retinopathy in a diverse cohort of people living with type 1 diabetes in a regional diabetes eye screening clinic. After a median follow-up of 6 years, 19% of the 1,876 people developed sight-threatening diabetic retinopathy. In multivariable Cox regression analyses, African Caribbean ethnicity, baseline systolic blood pressure, and baseline A1C were independent risk factors for sight-threatening diabetic retinopathy. Now, this is a novel observation, and I think future research needs to confirm this finding in other diverse populations, and the potential mechanisms need to be understood.
Indeed, Alice, and this raises the question of whether ethnicity-specific targets for systolic blood pressure and hemoglobin A1C might be needed to combat the development of sight-threatening diabetic retinopathy. And now for something trendy. More recent GLP-1 agonists are receiving a lot of attention for their weight loss effects. Dr. Tim Heiss from Profil and colleagues performed a secondary analysis of a randomized clinical trial comparing tirzepatide 15 milligrams, semaglutide 1 milligram, and placebo administered weekly for 28 weeks, and investigated changes in body weight as well as in body composition, appetite, and energy intake. Both tirzepatide and semaglutide similarly reduced appetite and energy intake relative to placebo. However, tirzepatide led to an even greater loss of body weight than semaglutide, with a greater reduction in fat mass. Whether tirzepatide's additional agonist effects at the GIP receptor are responsible for inducing greater loss of fat mass, and whether that might operate through enhanced energy expenditure, is currently under ongoing investigation.
And it's really quite interesting to see the clinical data surrounding tirzepatide, but yet realizing that we don't fully understand how exactly this is happening. However, of course, that's not going to change our clinical practice, but it is fascinating to sort of watch this story develop. And if you're going to do something trendy, then I'm going to now do something techie. So Dr. Vera Lehman and colleagues, with the leadership of Dr. Christoph Stettler from the University Hospital of Bern, collected data from 2 wrist-worn wearables, specifically Garmin Vivo Active 4S and the Empatica E4, along with CGM values in adults living with diabetes on insulin. They then developed a machine learning approach to detect hypoglycemia non-invasively based on the wearable data. The model associated increased heart rate, decreased heart rate variability, and increased tonic electrodermal activity with hypoglycemia, and had an area under the receiver operating characteristic curve of 0.76 plus or minus 0.7, based solely on the wearable data, which falls into the fair to good range. Now, obviously, this is a pilot study and more work needs to be done, but I actually think this is quite cool because the utility of this could be for those who are not able to access CGM. And the reality is, at this point, many people around the world are still not able to access CGM based on affordability issues, and perhaps a wearable device that they can sort of keep for a long time may be a way around this for them to be able to detect hypoglycemia without CGM. So this, I think, is an area that we should certainly keep an eye on.
That's wonderful, Alice. And this brings us to the end of another episode of Diabetes Care on Air. And I'd like to make a special thanks to Mr. Rohan Arora, Dr. Bill Russell, and Professor Sammy Suissa for their time and insights.
And a reminder to everyone to let the people around you know about the opportunities to submit their original art for consideration to be included as a future cover for Diabetes Care. And of course, a big thank you to all of you for tuning into this episode. We welcome your comments and feedback, and don't forget to subscribe to the series to get notifications when a new episode comes out. Thank you for listening.